Today is the 21st of May 2013. We're here in Windsor interviewing Richard Allom, and interviewing you is Robert Riddel and myself, Janina, Gosseye.
First question. What architecture qualifications did you gain and from which institution?
Eventually I graduated out of Melbourne University, but I began at Queensland University, did 3 years here and failed third year, went drilling for oil, various reasons.
Money.
It was S.P. Dodds, who was a colleague of ours, I think a year ahead of me at UQ, who was determined to take longer to graduate than his father. His father had taken 10 years to graduate. S.P. was determined to break that record. He'd set off. He'd left and was drilling for oil on the Barrier Reef, and wrote to me and said, "This is the life. This has come up here." So I applied to the same company and got a job drilling for oil in Bass Strait, which was not quite as romantic or tropical.
Wrong direction.
But I fell in love with Melbourne while I was doing that, and so my last 3 years were at Melbourne University.
Which year did you start at UQ?
Oh, let me think. It would have been 1964, I think, at UQ. And probably 4 years, well, maybe longer, at maybe late 60s, or even early 70s at Melbourne University. Because I've done 3 years at UQ, I think 2 or 3 years drilling for oil, and then went to Melbourne University and finished there. So that's how I come to have a degree from Melbourne University.
So when did you graduate?
71.
71. Okay. And the architectural teachers that you studied under, I mean, do you remember any of them as being particularly memorable or useful?
I think the person who influenced me most was a man called George Tibbets at Melbourne University, who taught history, who really awakened my interest in history in a practical way. History had been taught at UQ by Bill Carr, who taught in a fairly traditional way from prehistory through to the modernists. Inevitably, time ran out. By the time we got to the modernists, there was very little time to deal with history as it was spoken. George Tibbets took it the other way, took another tack altogether and taught history backwards. So he looked at Melbourne and what was happening in Melbourne at that time, and said, "This is why Melbourne is shaped this way. This is what's happening in Melbourne," and made history live for me. He also was an activist. In those days, he was terribly concerned with the Victorian Housing Commission's demolition of the inner suburbs. So not only were we taught history and the value of the inner suburbs and the planning of Melbourne by Hoddle, but we were encouraged to go out and lie in front of the bulldozers to stop Mr. Volti and Mr. Thompson tearing down whole swathes of the inner suburbs. An activity that appealed to me quite a bit, I must say. I'd had a very nice... it was an age of protest. It was an age of...
Yeah, and more so later in Queensland.
Yes, I think I was. Melbourne politicised me as much as anything else. I mean, these were the days of the Vietnam War. I was sharing a house with people a year younger than me who were waiting to see if their marble came out of the barrel to be sent to Vietnam. I don't think I had a political thought before I went to Melbourne and shared housing with blokes who could be sent off to war the next day. And of course Melbourne, then as now is a far more political capital than most others. So there were lovely anti-Vietnam marches, and it seemed to me that's what one did. That was part of university life. It was that political part of life, and that, as I say, flowed into architecture. Architecture then, to me, became, in part, and a large part, a political act.
So what was the difference between University of Queensland and Melbourne University in the way they approached architecture?
I don't think I ever had a really. I can't remember being enthused about architecture at Queensland University in any real way. I mean, in those days, UQ taught the Bauhaus, taught architecture on the Bauhaus theory. Bill Carr did a lovely job again. I think he must have been my year one master, and we did all the Gestalt theory and taking away all the ideas that we'd grown up with and whatever. It was starting again. It was good Bauhaus stuff, and I think Bill Carr and the university taught it quite well. At the same time, we had to study pure and applied maths. We had to study geology with the geologist. I don't suppose we studied structure with the engineers, although we might have done. It was a legacy of the architecture school being part of engineering, and I don't think there was really a lot of time to teach design and to discuss design. There was certainly interest in it, but I don't remember that. I think what I took most from my time at UQ was in fact Archi Review, which is the other sort of great guiding principle in my life after politics, or equally with politics, was architecture as theatre. And Dick Stringer and John Railton, I think both Melbourne graduates, introduced in my first or second year the idea that we could have some theatre in architecture, and Archi Review became a major, absolute major part of my education. I mean, whole semesters were given terms in those days. Middle term for several years there was just given over to Archi Review, and then people like Willie Young took that further with his theatrical experience, his theatrical performances of Catch and Black Catch and wonderful stuff. And so theatre, I mean, architecture is theatre, but it was a fairly important part of my early architectural training. I don't remember anyone in particular I mean, Ian Cinnamon was a year master, and he was one of the first people who, I don't suppose he's much older than we were, but he was certainly an influence on my understanding. But I don't think I sort of saw architecture as something I must do or needed to have at that time. Although I'd had an interest in architecture for a long time.
So why did you choose it in the first place?
I wish I knew, Bob. I think, and interestingly, I must have known that I wanted to be an architect from quite early in the piece, because I was at school at the Brisbane Grammar School, and one of the prerequisites for getting into architecture at UQ was that one had to have a senior pass in geometrical drawing and perspective or art. And while I was at the grammar school, taught neither of those subjects, and I went to, in those days, I think it was the Central Technical College, now then it became QIT, now QUT, and I studied geometrical drawing after school, and on Saturday mornings I'd go down there, and Duncan McPhee's mother would teach art. And I think I passed both of those subjects to get into architecture. But I wasn't a good student at school, and the idea that I would take out of school time to study something sounds completely foreign to me now. But I must have known that's what I wanted to do.
Well,
I never had any doubts about it. I mean, I think I just had a good time in architecture. Architecture was just, and still is, what I love to do. The whole freedom, the idea of design thinking, as they call it now, is just central to my whole, how I am. I loved every second of it.
But you, earlier than that, you were introduced to architecture through your family? I mean,
Yes.
Did your father use an architect for his house? That sort
Well,
of thing?
well, yes, they did use an architect because I had Mum's brother, George Calishaw, was an architect, and he designed the house for them over at Clayfield. But I wasn't exposed to architecture. I don't know that I had a couple of uncles who were architects. Mum's family had architects way back, the Calishaws, but there are Alloms as architects as well. But I don't think I don't remember having sort of a mentor saying, you'd make a good architect, or an uncle that I'd go to and say, I want to be an architect. It was just something that I grew into, I suspect.
So your contemporaries, when you were studying, did any of them turn out to be significant?
That's a really good. Yes, I think many of the people that I came through had actually turned out to be quite good architects. I'm not sure how significant we all are at the end of the day. The interesting thing to me is that it's a bit of a generational exercise. Of the people I studied with in Melbourne in my year at Melbourne University, 3 or 4 ended up in the same field as I, in studying, in doing heritage work. Ray Tonkin, who was director of the Victorian Heritage Council for a long time, was in my year. Gordon Loader, who was headed up the Melbourne City Council Heritage Section, all in my year. And even here, you, Bob, with your interest in history and conservation, although we weren't in the same year, we were close through this Architect Student Association. Don Watson. I think there was an era there where we all we had that sense of history. It's another whole exercise and question as to why that happened in that generation.
But it was political, as you say, and you saw people who were in control, not valuing these things, and you wanted to do something.
Yes, but I think that's true, and that's the role of the young to take that position. But I think the idea that we took it as history and the conservation of buildings with another whole exercise. It wasn't something we invented. It was all around. I remember you introducing me to a book when we stayed with you in a basement flat in Islington, a book by a man called Crosby, I think, called The Essential Monument about London.
Oh, yeah. The Necessary Monument.
Necessary Monument, yes. It was an idea whose time had come. I appreciate that, but I'm often fascinated at how many of us actually sort of fell into that mould.
You mentioned that at Melbourne University was Rich Tibbetts that kind of was the
Yes,
protagonist leading these demonstrations. Was there anybody at UQ that you could think was more of a protagonist or of the staff members?
Not quite, not in the same way, and simply because Melbourne was, as I say, was and still is a far more political capital, and in the 1960s, Brisbane was still, if it wasn't a provincial city, it was seen by us as a provincial city. People grew up and left Brisbane in those days. There was no suggestion that you'd stay here. I went to Melbourne for various reasons. Bob went to London, but it was just what we did. It was just like, here today, gone tomorrow. And there was no real option. There was no real option. Today, of course, the students, have opportunity to study in foreign universities as part of their mainstream course, which is a lovely thing. And communication today is so much faster and more direct. At Queensland University, the information flow was so much related to depended on the printed word. The university library, which is in the tower in the main building at the University of Queensland, would have magazines sent in on a regular basis, and we knew, most of us I guess, knew which days different magazines would come in. There would be a rush to get a copy of Japan Architect or architectural design toward the end. Architectural design was an enormous influence on me, together with history. It was the rebellious nature of AD. It was the absolute modernism that came out of AD. The whole archigram. It was another wonderful eye opener to me, but a foreign import, completely lacking any sort of. Well, I think it certainly had no sort of sense of context the way we all started to think later on. But I know all those English architects were wonderful. Cedric Price was a great hero of mine. Lovely man.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't have known about him if it hadn't been for AD.
AD was wonderful.
And later on the AA, but...
Were you in Brisbane when that student conference took place in 1967?
Yes, I must have been here, and then I went, yes, and that was an enormous influence as well. An Englishman called Tony Gwilym came out here, knocked our socks off, and then stayed and made inflatable furniture. Where did all the hippies go?
Were you still a student when he was teaching there?
I don't think he ever taught me. I think he was. Did he come up from Melbourne for our conference, or did he come here for the conference?
He came from Britain, but I don't
he
really know.
He went to Melbourne University after that. He taught at Melbourne Uni, but he didn't teach me, so he must have been gone by the time I'd finished my time in Bass Strait and ended up there. But no, and the student conferences generally were wonderful opportunities. In those days, the AASA, the Architectural Students Association, Australian Architectural Students Association, would run a conference every year. Yeah. And we'd drive to these faraway ports and have lovely, I guess, like most conferences, the content was less important than meeting other people and finding out what was going on. But the AASA worked very well in Brisbane as well. I was at UQ, Bob was at QUT, and we used to meet in the old Institute headquarters on Coronation Drive and plan to change the world. And Haig Beck would do the magazine. Still, you talk about people born to do a certain job. Haig Beck would do the student magazine in 1968 or whatever, and still doing it. Lovely stuff. None of us have changed, but it was a wonderful opportunity, wasn't it? That cross-pollination, it's so important.
Well, there was an older generation that were taking part too, like John Davis and Bill Heather and Hume.
Yeah, Graham Hume.
Graham Hume. And Jeff Webster. They were all there too.
But they were a fraction older than us, Bob. Yeah. I think our generation was really the first of the post-war baby boomers. I think the Graham Humes and the Bill Heathers and whatever were just a bit more, or a bit less likely to rebel. Yeah. They were just slightly more
conservative,
conventional, if not conservative. I think. I often think how lucky we were to have that post-war. I have brothers-in-law who are a few years older than me, and they still don't understand what it is that the post-war people have. They still don't get it. Fantastic luck. And so, I remember standing in the street outside Festival Hall, having seen the Beatles perform. Okay? And I remember thinking consciously, absolutely, it came to me as a conscious realisation that here were all these people, our own age, standing in the street. It was my first opportunity to stand in the street with a crowd of people, something I still enjoy. I remember thinking that we were a lucky generation, and that then just flowed through. It was this giant wave of influence that's still, that's still influencing the superannuation industry and the retirement villages. I mean, we still have power.
Well, did you do any other study after Melbourne?
No, I didn't. No, I did no other study. I didn't. And partly in those days, it was 1 degree was all one really needed, and partly because I, within a very short time, within a few years, I was employed and set up, but then I set up my own practice, and there just wasn't the opportunity. I didn't see the opportunity to do that then.
But I mean, you didn't stop learning. I mean, ICOMOS and all of that was a great endeavour. But what practices did you work in during your student years? I mean, you would have done a few.
Not that many. I worked for Wittgesell, and he was very kind to me. I'd come there in holidays and whatever, and Barry Reuter and I used to sit there. Anyway, he ran an interesting practice. He was a good designer, at least had been a good designer. I think probably less so when I was there. I'm not sure how old he was when I was working there. I worked for John Railton, and again a very generous employer, and I learned a lot from John Railton. He was a hero of mine.
All of us.
That's right. And had built that house for himself, and was continuing to build houses.
This is the Spring Hill House.
The Spring Hill House. His office was in the basement, in a little room at the Spring Hill House where the water came through the wall and whatever. The nice thing about John Railton was that he'd married Sue Goodser, another sort of architectural history. Sue worked at Craftsman's Market for Giorgio Grucci. I mean, I thought I was in sort of socially acceptable heaven. But the really nice thing is that for lunch, John would say, "Come upstairs and have some lunch," and he would put on lunch that was just would be sort of exotic cheeses and slices of salami. I mean, stuff that I'd never seen. My mother's idea of a salad was a tin of beetroot and some grated carrot. The Railtons had this lovely. I thought it was just. I was so lucky to work there. But I don't mean lucky because of the way he made lunch. He was a lovely designer. He had whimsical is not the right word. But he could see things from first principles, and he would just say, "I could just a little." And he was just a lovely, gentle designer. Some of his houses were just the most beautiful, thoughtful buildings.
So you would have seen a few of them?
Oh yes. The clients were. There was a Galway house with a long, thin building with cupboards that moved within this sort of sausage of building to define rooms as the house grew and changed. He did a couple out on the north side that were so light and elegant with solid glass panels and asbestos in the opening sashes, or asbestos sheeting in the opening sashes. And they were so light. I remember going out to doing a site inspection one day, and the builder said, "What sort of crazy architect is this that puts glass in the walls and sheeting in the windows?" And then he took. There was a column that rose. I guess it was 4 inches square, and rose over 2 levels. And the builder took this column and gave it a shake, and the whole house. And it was just. He was a lovely architect. He's a lovely architect. I'm not sure what his work was like in the United States, but he was an absolute hero and influence on me, and I was very lucky to work there. I'm probably not for very long. I can't remember, how many months I was there, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about being an architect. I think I learned a lot about how to think, or how one could think. how he liberated my thinking to a degree.
So it was just those two that you worked for? Or?
That's all I can remember in Brisbane. Yes, I think that's all. I mean, in those days one had to work in vacation, holiday time to keep, and one kept a logbook, so that when you came to register as an architect, you had to demonstrate that you'd actually had some practical experience. I was talking to a Melbourne friend the other day, Ian Godfrey, and he reminded me that when I went for registration in Melbourne, I wrote to the registrar, and I said the candidate will not be submitting a logbook for these reasons. I made some sort of argument. I mean, Ian at the time, in 1970, was absolutely gobsmacked that you could actually be so arrogant as to say to the registrar, you don't know what you're talking about, but here's how it goes. So I tended to come home from Melbourne at the Christmas holidays and not work here, although I think that Gosseye put me up a few times. But I didn't, I didn't work much as a student.
Do you remember any of the projects that you worked on when you were in Gossaye's office?
Where his office even was?
His office was in the CML building opposite, next to the post office. The CML, the old CML, and it was goodness knows what the floor plan was in the building, but the office was about 8 foot wide and maybe 20 foot long, and the benches along the windows. The old drawings were stored in rolls in racks above your head and looked as if they were going to fall any moment. And the plan printing was done using ammonia, a bottle of ammonia in a tube, and you took the lid off the ammonia, rolled this drawing up and stuck it over the head of the bottle and opened the window so we weren't all asphyxiated. It was terrible. It was primitive. When you think about architectural practices and our offices today, some of the George Street practices are the views of the bay and whatever. And we put our old Britkas there looking into the side of the post office and holding his printing machine out the window.
And both at Gossay's and Railton's, it was predominantly houses, residential, smaller projects? Or?
Yes, John Railton was mostly houses. Gossay's were, I think he had a bit of, we did a post office on the far side. I can't remember very much what we did at Gossay's office. It was a, I think you probably know more about this than I do, Bob, but I think he'd had a partnership split with someone.
Blackburn and Gosseye.
That sounds right, yes, could be. Blackburn, Gosseye, and I'm not sure. I mean, he had a lovely history himself. I mean, he arrived here with his father and began his life, his working life, pigeon-proofing buildings, crawling into roof spaces and filling them with white. I mean, he had a tough life, and I think
he was Italian.
Yeah, certainly immigrant, Bob, and I'm not sure, but I really should go and look up and see what his background, what his design life was.
Maybe Austrian.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Vitali sounds Italian.
Yeah. I always had an idea that he'd been a good designer, but when I was working for him, he was a bit. The practice really wasn't doing as well as it might have done.
You didn't know anything he designed?
No. What did he do?
I don't.
He did that awful theatre up at Bowen Hills.
Really?
He was doing that for years.
Oh. Probably for very little fee.
I think that's right.
And when you were working in the office, it was you and Barry
Reuter.
That were there? Were there other people working in the office?
I suspect not. I think it was a tiny office and just the two of us. And I know it was Barry Reuter because he and I would go across the road. There was a pub across the road where Robert Gibson built the extension to Anzac Square later. I can't think what it was called now. You can remember Bob?
Royal?
Could have been the Royal, yeah. And we'd have some lunch downstairs and then take a beer up and sit on the upstairs veranda looking out over Queen Street, and we'd see Mr. Gazelle coming home from his lunch, no doubt at a club somewhere or other, and we'd finish our beer and rush downstairs and get into the lift before him. So by the time he came back into the building, we were hard at work.
Barry Reuter worked up in Spring Hill. I can't think of who for, but anyway, that was probably earlier. That was in 63, 64, 65. When I was at Conrad Gargett, he was working. It'll come to me. Yes, we should. We need to do all of that. Anyway, this project is doing that. It's connecting people where they worked, when, and trying to get those networks.
Get the names. Yes, that's right.
Who were the architects you most admired when you were a student?
Both locally and national, international.
Well, you see, in Brisbane, I don't think there were architects that I knew I admired. I admired Bruce Goodser. Bruce Goodser was maybe a couple of years ahead of me at UQ, and the lower years were in the old social sciences building. The upper years were up in the tower. The upper years, with Bruce leading the way, came down one day to help us design posters for Archie Review, I think. And we were all, must have been our first year, we were all sort of using sort of hard pencils and whatever. And he said, no, this is what you do. And he rolled out a sheet of newsprint, or the tail end of a newsprint roll on the floor, and took a 4-inch paintbrush and said, this is how you paint, and slopped it around. I thought that is amazing. It may have been in that meeting, or it may have been in another, when he gave me the line that I've lived with since then, and that is, your mother is wrong. And for a first year student, that was pretty important, to have, and not Bill Carr, not Bill Gregg or Ian Fenneman. No one had been game to say, to counter that sort of that conservative understanding that your mother was right by saying your mother is wrong. So Bruce Goodser was an enormous influence, and of course later on, that building he built at UQ, years later, was it the Vet Science Building?
What they call the Hartley Teakle.
Yeah, the Hartley Teakle appealed to me. I mean, the Students' Union voted it the ugliest building and it wanted it torn down, but it appealed to my rebellious nature. It was clever building, clinker brick and just clever.
Which is Birrell.
Was it Birrell? Was you at Birrell's, was it? Oh, it was Birrell's, but Bruce was doing the work, wasn't he?
Yes. And Don was working on it too.
Oh, that's right. Oh, they were all there. I mean, I remember the day when I was holidaying at the South Coast when Birrell advertised for staff. I suppose he was looking for a student, I can't remember. I drove up from the beach. By the time I'd parked the car, but in those days Birrell's office was in the old Rex Arcade in the valley. There was a queue of wannabe architects running all the way down Wickham Street. And I thought, this will never work. But it worked perfectly because the interview was about 2 minutes. Birrell and Cully were there interviewing people. The first question was, is your father an architect? And if you got through that one, it was okay. And the second one was, show us what you've got. You rolled out your drawing. And I've never been dismissed quite like it said. I've just straight out the door. And Don got the Guernsey on that day, and that must have been pretty influential for Don Watson's career. He did perspectives for 7 years. But
Bruce Goodser.
Goodser, yes. No, so he was influential, and Birrell, of course, was terribly influential. I mean, Birrell was our hero in a way you say Railton was. I mean, you know, Union College and just everything he did was amazing. I mean, by then the centenary pool was well and truly up, but an absolutely gobsmacking exercise. And it was years later, of course, that I recognised. At the time, I didn't appreciate quite how influential and able he was politically to look at that Wickham Terrace car park, which is still probably the nicest bit of architecture in town. I mean, it's just a lovely building. I still choose to park there rather than anywhere else in town. I just love the coffered ceilings and the concrete work, and the quality of the construction is amazing. I mean, you could write an essay on the concrete. It's so smooth. How they did it. How he managed it.
And the planning is exceptional too. I mean, there's no other car park that did what it did.
No.
With ramped floors.
Oh, and the ramp floors and the exit, the spiral ramp to exit. No, it's a clever building, a lovely building. No, of course Birrell was influential, but I don't remember. In retrospect, there were two. When you ask, how I became an architect, why I chose architecture, I can remember two being influenced architecturally twice as a younger person. The first was a visit to a house up here owned by the Kappa family called Oakwell, owned then and now by relatives of mine. And I must have been there with a party with Mum and Dad. I must have been quite small, but I remember being amazed at how thick the walls were. I remember being struck by a sense of substance and solidity in this house. Now, I couldn't tell you anything else about this house other than I remember walking through it and thinking, this is pretty amazing. Now, I might have been 10 at the time, and childhood memories are strange, but I do remember being in that house and thinking, this is pretty amazing. The other thing I remember in retrospect is a visit to the Plywood Exhibition House. Now, what year was that? Was that 58?
This was Heathwood.
Was it 56?
56, what? No, it's a bit later than that.
About then.
And again, I was there with my parents, who were friends with the Hancock family, and it was a Hancock and Gore, plywood, whatever. And I remember looking at that house and thinking, as a child, and thinking, this is amazing. And they tell me it still survives, not on that site, but I could almost draw you a plan of that house. I just walked around. My mum and dad had a drink and said how amazing modern architecture was. I remember looking at this building and thinking, this is really amazing. I can tell you where it was. It was sort of under that, just up from the subway, behind the Ernest Baines, is it? I mean, it was elevated in the most artificial location, but just wonderful, just incredible house.
Mm. Well, it's out at the Gap. One of Peter Heathwood's children lives in it.
Oh, truly.
Mm.
And were there other international architects that you admired when you were studying architecture or later on?
Well, I mean, as I say, the limits for information flow were very real in those days. But certainly, even at UQ, there was Korb and Mies, and I mean, there were the basic sort of people that we knew about.
And Japan architect? I mean,
yes, Japan architect, but we were always told you couldn't build like that here because there wasn't the concrete skills and whatever. But Japan architect was pretty interesting, wasn't it? It was Japan architect. Yes, amazing.
Well, and also progressive architecture from the US. I mean,
I didn't use that so much. Domus I loved. I thought but no one could afford Domus,
Yeah. Well, when Gio Ponti came to Brisbane.
Yes,
I mean, here, Mr. Domus himself.
Yes, that's right.
Do you remember anything about that?
No, I don't. You see, I know he was here. I remember No, I don't. I remember going to see Buckminster Fuller in Melbourne, and when Fuller had started lecturing about 9 o'clock in the morning, he was still going about 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
I can remember going to see Buckminster Fuller, but in Perth. Could
No.
you be talking about the same thing?
Yes, I probably are. It was probably the same.
Did you go to Perth?
Don't think I did.
That was a big trip. I remembered it.
I remember the Melbourne. The Melbourne conference was fairly new materials, new architecture. It was at the Brisbane conference. It was the Melbourne conference.
I went to the Melbourne conference, but I can't remember anything else except being in Carlton and thinking this is the place.
This is it. Right.
Counter lunches and terrace houses and Bohemia.
Yes, wonderful.
Mm.
I still think that, boy. I love it.
What are we doing here?
I don't know. I often wonder.
Oh well. All right, we'll go on to your career then, architectural career. When and where did you start practicing as an architect?
We're going to run out of years here, aren't we? But I came back from. As I graduated, when I did my undergraduate thesis, it was about a school in North Carlton, based on Cedric Price's Think Belt. Cedric Price's Think Belt, yes, the Pottery's Think Belt. Pottery's Think Belt. And for my undergraduate thesis, I took a disused railway line that ran up through North Carlton and proposed a series of learning places that scattered along this railway line, so the train would move students up and down. And on the basis of that, I worked for my first job at graduation was with a firm in Melbourne called Rosman, Hastings and Sorrell, and I worked there documenting a secondary school somewhere or other. And then from there I moved, and my career was largely directed toward education. And from there I moved across to UDPA Planners, that's Urban Design and Planning Associates, which was the planning arm of Bates, Smart and McCutcheon, and it was run by Andrew McCutcheon, another sort of influential person in my life, very generous, competent, open planner and architect. And they were doing university planning all over Victoria. Victorian education system required these plans. I can't think what they were called now. So I did that. Then I worked. I worked on childcare and preschool stuff for UDPA, and then I moved to Young and Freeman. And I went to Young and Freeman because they had just been commissioned to do a university in Darwin. And I started work there. I was to start work there on the 2nd of January, and on Christmas Eve prior to that, Cyclone Tracy went through Darwin, and so I went up there a couple of times, ostensibly to start work on the whole thing, but because nobody really understood how much damage had been done to Darwin. So anyway, after a couple of months, it was clear the university in Darwin wasn't to go ahead. And at that point, Midge and I and Sam, who was a baby at that time, went overseas. That's when we met you in London. And when we came back, decided to come back to Brisbane, I think we said we'd come back for 18 months. It might have been 3 years, on the basis that my sister was not well, Midge's mother was not well. We thought we'd get everybody lined up and sorted out and go back to Melbourne. We kept the house in Melbourne, bought this house. Midge bought this house. We bought this house. And I arrived here without a job. Don Watson, it was the tail end of the Whitlam years, and Gough Whitlam had introduced the concept of the national estate. I think he'd been dismissed the November before we came back up here. But the national trusts around the country were being funded through the government system to set up a conservation, cultural conservation framework. And Don Watson had been, again with that interest in history, had been doing some work for the National Trust, and he took me down to the Trust and said to Peter Forrest, who was the director at the time, you need to employ Dick Allom, and I started work the next day.
This is in Old Government House?
This is in Old Government House, and in those days the National Trust had one room and part of an enclosed veranda. And I had a lovely time. The National Trust employed me for several years, and we travelled throughout Queensland. Just it was the first. It was a very informed and intelligent first pass that Peter Forrest had in mind, and we'd look at a building very briefly, maybe half a day, maybe a couple of hours, and I'd do a sketch and write a few notes about what was important or not important about it, and then so the files would then just have this sort of this as I say, first pass of what was important and what was possible in Queensland. And Peter did the same thing in the Northern Territory some years later, and I worked with him up there, and we did the same thing. We drove all over both Queensland and the Northern Territory just looking at buildings, and I saw places that I would never have seen otherwise. The National Trust was very good. And the nice thing about it, of course, is George Tibbets, that we talked about before, had introduced a whole generation to the idea of conservation plans. George Tibbets' history wasn't just learning about how to stop the Housing Commission. One of the exercises in Tibbets' history class was to choose a building, to measure it, to research its history, and to write a little essay about it. So the University of Melbourne, then and probably still now, has this amazing file of resource of what I call first pass ideas about a building, so that rather than just waiting for whole sort of government surveys to come past, all these organisations were just coming to grips with what we really had here. So that was the National Trust.
Who else was there?
Bob Martin was there, another one to track down and interview. Lindy Croft was there for a while.
Bob Moore?
Bob Moore, yeah, Bob Moore. That's right. Amazing. I mean, there's a whole...
Meredith wasn't there?
Oh, yes, Meredith was there. Oh, yes. Oh, no, Meredith Walker. Meredith Walker. Now, she was up from Sydney, and again, just wandered down one day and said, well, is there a job here? And Peter Forrest said, well, I don't know. And I remember saying to Peter Forrest, she's wearing a Marimekko dress. She can't be all bad. No. Amazing. Meredith Walker. Yes, all there.
And how long were you there?
Again, probably not that long, but probably only 3 or 4 years.
That's long.
But then the grant money ran out, of course, with the changes of government, and Peter Forrest left, and then Meredith and I lost our jobs soon after. Terry Conway was there. Anyway, and the National Trust, as a sort of a consolation to my being dismissed, said, here are a few jobs that you can finish up. And so with that I was thrust into private practice, and I rented space from the Trust in what's in Old Government House is now called the dining room, and for a work table we had the table that was the original Senate room table. We had a 20-foot long table.
And what year was that when you said
Oh, God, goodness knows what year that was. 76 maybe, 75. And then we moved from there to Spring Hill to a little shop that flooded every shower of rain.
I remember it well.
I do. Can I tell that story? At that time, Bob, a friend of mine, Rod Stendrow, was involved with an organisation called Bush Pilots, and Bush Pilots wanted a fit out, was it, to a building in the city, and you were working on that, Bob, and anyway, the drawings had been made and the model had been presented, and the Bush Pilots people were invited to come to the office to see the drawing. And they duly turned up with gathering storm clouds outside, and one of the Bush Pilots people was this tall girl called Lurleen. I can remember Lurleen. And she, like so many tall blondes, she had a shoe fetish, and she had a pair of red shoes. All this is clear in my mind. She had a pair of red shoes with heels about so high. And this was a very scrubby little loft with seagrass matting. Anyway, after we'd looked at the drawings or whatever, there was even more rumbling, and then suddenly the clouds burst and started to rain and rain and rain.
So it was Water Street.
It was Water Street. We all huddled in this little building, and then suddenly the water started coming in the back door. And it trickled across the floor, and after a few minutes it was inches deep, running across the floor of the office. And Lurleen took off her shoes and stood on a chair. It was terrible. How we so much for the professional life. It was wonderful, wonderful. And we thought it was, and I remember thinking at the time, private practice can't be that hard. Given the fees that architects charge, we can undercut all of that. These blokes must be just robbing the industry blind. And after about 6 months, of course, you realise it wasn't true. Yes, and from there we moved to your office in Brunswick Street. We were there for, I think we come for 6 months. We were there for 7 years or something like that. No, it was. No, I fell into private practice, but again had a lovely time. The freedom to do things and go places, and the opportunities to. The thing about the conservation practice in those days is that no one else was doing it. Well, no one else was doing it in Brisbane. Clive Lucas was operating in Sydney, but I think he and I were the only ones really doing it. And I was just inventing it as we went along. We just made things up. This was what you did. We had to create the discipline. We had to find the clients, and then do it. But the opportunity to travel and to see things in practice was amazing.
You're talking about travel in Australia? Or?
Oh yes, in Australia, and mostly in Queensland, Northern New South Wales, Northern Territory. We had an association with Peter Lovell in Melbourne from quite early on, but generally Peter did the southern part of the country, and we did the north. There was no real. I didn't do a lot of work. I mean, from time to time, I'd go to Melbourne and look at some of his work. Together, we looked at Western Australia.
But you joined together about that time, didn't you?
Don't you ask me what date it was. There were. It grew slowly. Originally, it was just Allom plus Lovell, and we just ran in parallel. And then it became, and then it was formalised as Allom, Lovell, Marcus Kyle, one of Peter Marcus Kyle, who began as an employee, then became a director.
Yeah, well, that all happened in the Water Street time.
Did it? I can't.
The Marcus Kyle bit might have been a bit later, but.
Yes, it was just Richard Allom architects in the old days, I think. And that's and most of that was that. And the other great opportunity that I've had in travelling was to work with ICOMOS, and it was a bit like the Architectural Student Conference. ICOMOS would have a meeting once a year, always in a different city or provincial one. And the opportunity then to do the tour that went with the conference was enormous, and we'd look at things and see things that one would never see, and in an informed way. I mean, people were enthused about it. It was an era of enormous enthusiasm.
And so that group of people, Clive Lucas and Peter Forrest and
Miles Lewis and Jim Kerr, and all of those people were an enormous influence on me. The writing of the Borough Charter was brought out my sort of understanding, that sort of love of words, that opportunity to discuss things endlessly. I mean, I think today it's gone a bit far, but in those days I loved it. We'd spend days discussing minute points of clauses, whether it should come this way or that way, and
I remember one of those discussions with Meredith Walker and you about what was the right word, and I think the right word was embodied.
Yes.
And I mean, but the Borough Charter was enormously influential and still is.
Well, I'm not sure that it is, but to me the important thing from the Borough Charter was that it facilitated a philosophic debate. The Charter itself is. I'm not sure how influential the Charter is. I said to someone the other day, how many people actually read the Charter? I see they're doing another review now. I just think it's a terrible waste of the intellectual resources that ICOMOS has to keep going back to this Borough Charter. But I think to debate the philosophy of conservation, the basic question, why are we doing this? And will it have lasting value? And does it have any value, or is it just a fashion? And many people today see the whole heritage and conservation industry as just a fashion. It was an era, and in those days with old buildings, now it's plastic furniture or whatever, tilt slab dreams. But and one of the great lost opportunities, I think, of all those years of when we were all sort of heavily into conservation, was that lost opportunity to really talk about why we're doing this. Another name that not related to Queensland Architect, but is Peter Freeman, who worked for the Heritage Commission and wrote those lovely books about woolsheds and homesteads of the arena. He and I were in an ICOMOS meeting somewhere during that period, and the questions were being asked, or there was a discussion of some sort taking place, and the question was asked, are there any other criteria, or are there any other motives that we should build into this particular clause or chart or whatever we're doing? And Peter Freeman wrote on a systems card, mystery and romance, and he passed it across to me. Now I kept that card on my pinboard in front of my desk for 20 years, because mystery and romance is as much a motivator as benevolent goodwill, all those other things. That's what that's what it's all about. Well, it is, but it was that opportunity in that quick glimpse of a philosophy. Why are we doing this whole exercise? Now, people who build, architects who build, have an opportunity to say, that's what I've left behind. There's my building, and my philosophy is embedded in the building. Okay, you can see what I think about that. Much of the work that we did was far more abstract than that, and certainly didn't have a concrete form. I mean, some of it, we did some buildings, but I think that was the missing link, I think, in much of what took place in conservation in those 20 or 30 years.
Well, just thinking back, what were the projects that you think were worthwhile that you did? Well, the most important.
I think the most important thing is that we took on we took a range of buildings on that we were able to argue for conservation across a range of buildings and unloved buildings. When I worked at the National Trust, the then president, Mr. Hancock, cautioned me against taking an interest in timber houses. He said, "This is not what we're on about here." And they were the days of the National Trust doing town halls and cathedrals and whatever. And I think that the recognition that we all took in the vernacular and not even the vernacular, the modest, the ruins, was a very important thing that we did. We brought recognition to the modest and the ordinary, and to me that's the most important thing we did. We were able to look at buildings and say these are important. I mean, later on we were able to say some of this is not so important, and I think that's really the argument today. I think in many ways conservation and conservation practice has been, I'm not sure it's borough charter, but it's a bureaucratisation of heritage where everything has to be ticked off. You know, does it represent any of these themes? Is it in any of these regions? I mean, anything can be declared heritage if you push hard enough.
But I mean, to buy a house like this, sort of, you know, you had an interest in what?
Well, yes, there was an interest in it, and it wasn't just the buying of it; it was the doing it up. I mean, the fussing in this house, the money and time that we spent doing up this house, getting everything just right, the lime plaster and horsehair, the taking up a perfectly good floor and putting down the half-inch concrete slab to replace the patent cement. I mean, the whole thing was just bizarre. Nobody could recognise it, and nobody could do it anymore. The other problem, the trades that were just dying out and we revived for a brief moment, have now gone. I've got half-round gutters on this house, Bob, that were specially made, and they're soldered and then held with tinsman's rivets. Okay? Now,
Thinking.
20 years later, a few of them are starting to go. I've got a few long lengths there. I can't find anyone who has any skill or interest to do it anymore. And I think, well, that's just gone. In Britain, I watch the television programs and I see them, making lime and making wrought iron fittings and whatever, and I think that's the way to go. But in this country and in this state, it doesn't happen anymore.
Probably happens in New South Wales, huh?
Oh well, I mean, one of the most recent sort of repair jobs we've had here is having some cracking in the brick walls repaired after the drought and the floods. The walls start to open a little bit. We've had a plasterer here called Brian Maxwell, who you probably know, who's just a genius. He's gone to live in the south, but he just mixes up mortars that so they're yellow and sandy and loamy, and you could eat them. They're just beautiful. And he sits up there at a scale and works on his own, calm as anything. Wants to talk to you about it. He wants to tell you what the mixes are. I've used this particular mix. I said, just punch the hole in the wall, bro. No, they're around. Anyway, so to me that's the important thing I did. I mean, the other nice thing I think that we introduced to the heritage, to the idea of heritage, was the idea of mixing old and new, which today is just accepted. In fact, the City Council and heritage people will now say, we don't want invisible mending. Clive Lucas's term was invisible mending. He could make a fiberglass chimney top and a long time ago. Today, the idea of adding new to old or mixing periods is accepted. We did that the Theosophical Society up on Wickham Terrace years ago now. We got and that was a 19th century cottage, quite a nice little cottage that had been adapted and extended by your mate Dodds. And we did the work on that building, keeping both stages. Now, I remember the jury, the architectural jury that year, gave us second or third prize on the basis that it wasn't consistent, and it might have been better if we turned it back into the 19th century cottage. Not on. It was never in part of my thinking to think that way. And it wasn't just Dodds, it was just that era of history. And we carried that through later with buildings like the Rockhampton Roundhouse, where we left all the rust and weeds and grease and whatever, and inserted a new slick little glass building inside. And I thought that was a pretty nice little attempt, but completely misunderstood by the client, everybody. The contextualism of that hall at Birdsville. I went to Birdsville to deal with the Royal Hotel. It was a crumbling ruin. I photographed it and measured it and whatever. And as I got off the plane, David Brooke, who was probably still is the mayor of Birdsville, said, "We're looking for an architect to come over here." And we designed that big shearing shed of a building.
I drew it. I drew it.
You drew it, yeah. And Nola drew it for the cover of Hague's magazine.
Right.
It's the picture on the wall still over there. It's just...
I've never been to see it, mind you.
Well, we designed it with an earth berm facing the prevailing winds and water to be sprinkled on the roof, and it was an environmentally sound, contextual working building.
Not a modern building.
Yes. Oh yes, it had that perforated aluminium ceiling lining that the locals would take great delight in throwing their beer cans up and dinging the ceiling. Anyway, after a couple of years, the council rang and said, "You better come out here, we need to air condition the building," and they put 4 giant evaporative coolers in the side of the building. I couldn't convince them in otherwise. They wanted an air conditioned building. This is the story of architecture, isn't it? You don't, So that's another sort. I mean, I like talking about architecture. I like taking that sort of quirky, taking a different view. I think is good for architecture, and I think that architects. You drive around the streets today. Brisbane, for example, is much better off architecturally than it was when you and I were around. They were still building 3-storey, walk-up blocks of flats in our day, Bob. And now it's much better, isn't it? I mean, I don't know whether that's CAD or whether that's the...
Oh no, it's just being in touch with the rest
world.
Of the world.
I think so, yeah.
But I guess the question we haven't asked you is, did you work with any colleagues you consider significant? I mean, you work with Don Watson on anything? Not directly. I don't think so. I mean, this is ridiculous. You're answering the question, asking the question, and I'm answering it. But you and I had a nice little symbiotic relationship in those early years in Brisbane. I remember you came to Melbourne, whether I was married or whether we were, and I would. Oh, you weren't married.
We weren't married. And we took the Renault 4, and you persuaded me to buy a Renault 4, and we drove a Renault 4 around the Western District.
Moonlight Head.
Moonlight Head.
I remember.
The great night, the store at Moonlight Head. But you influenced me. I mean, I remember you wrote to us in Melbourne. You were working at the Gold Coast for Clark Gazzard.
Yes.
Above the bikini woman's shop. What was her name?
Ivy Hassan.
Ivy Hassan, yeah. Anyway, you must have had your Porsche at that time. You wrote a letter, and they just built the new bridge over the Nerang River, and it must have been 4 lanes wide. And you wrote and said, "Here you are driving to work across the new superhighway, a jet's just flown over above. Isn't this effing amazing? Isn't this just wonderful?" You know,
It was fucking terrific.
it was just, you know, that enthusiasm. And I remember the same thing happened when we were in Melbourne. They built the Tullamarine Freeway. Rich and I used to take her little Fiat 600 and drive up and down the Tullamarine Freeway just for like a couple of Italians on Sunday. It was just wonderful. It was just amazing. I said before, your for sale list of stuff when you were heading off to the RCA, I still have a copy of it somewhere here. I designed a storage system in Melbourne based on Formatube, and you modified that to get into the RCA with one that actually had a bearing in the bottom that rotated. Remember that?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, we had a great time. I mean, and if I'd stayed in Brisbane or you hadn't gone to London, I mean, you know, but that's what we did in those days. We went our different ways.
Yeah.
But I think those early years in Brisbane were pretty, with the AASA, were pretty important. What about David Hunter, Dick Hunter? You going to track him down?
He's coming. He's coming to Brisbane shortly, and he will be interviewed.
Will he? Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you remember when?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Sorry, I'm getting over enthusiastic about your project.
Which buildings constructed in Queensland between 45 and 75 do you consider significant, either personally or generally? There's one.
Gee, I'm not sure. I'm not
Oh,
sure.
What about the Gold Coast? I mean, did you derive anything from that? I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on.
I think that the hotel at Broadbeach, Langer's Hotel, was clearly, and I remember that again as a young person, a child. I remember that, and the palm trees and the different coloured doors, and that would have been 1954 or 54. Pretty nice, and everyone mourns the loss of Leonard's Hotel. There's a very nice Leonard's Hotel in Toowoomba.
Yes.
Does anybody? Is it on a register? It's been painted awful. It's been called something else. You know, it's a lovely pub. I tried.
Working Wills at the moment.
Is it? Yeah. I tried to persuade the Toowoomba City Council to buy it. I said, you know, this is an important building. But there were only the two, weren't there? But
No, there was one in George Street.
did he do the George Street one?
He did the extension, the building on the corner of George and Anne, which was the new part.
I don't remember it. But the Gold Coast, the lens at Broadbeach was an amazing. I mean, historically, you know, could only have failed. I mean, they're built on a sandy. It was just such a desert. It was amazing. It was just such a desert.
Well, you know, if it had survived, look at it now, where it is. Would have been
so small compared to all that other rubbish. But
I mean, we talked about Riddel.
Riddel, yeah, Union College. Union College was amazing. What year was that?
I don't remember. It's got to be 66 or something.
But again, just you know, those windows that he must have imported from somewhere or other, the cupboard door that slid across and acted as a screen, and the door was open, and just that concrete and the turn of the building, the curve was just lovely.
But we don't know about Gazelle, but I mean Railton you've already talked about. But what other things by Langer? I mean, were you aware of St Peter's?
No,
School?
no.
Or any of the churches that he'd done?
No, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why I didn't. I'm not sure why I wasn't sort of pursuing that sort of architectural hero in my early years.
Did you have Langer as a tutor?
No.
And what about Hayes and Scott and Dalton? Any of their projects?
Yeah, Hayes and Scott. I still think are wonderful, but so few of those those lovely houses survive. I still sort of look for the odd black chimney or whatever. No, Hayes and Scott were amazing. Bolton I didn't warm to quite as much. No, I'm not quite. I don't know. I didn't have heroes in that sense. People I'd go to, and it took me a while. I mean, the first core building I ever saw was Ronshop, and I remember driving along in the combi van with Sam in the back seat or front seat, wherever he was, and we saw this little sign that said, Ronshop. The sign's about that big, and we went up there, and I was just absolutely gobsmacked at the whole exercise. There was a nun singing in the front, and then the other building, and I'd seen it must have been the most photographed building of that period. It took me a while to understand that whole idea of context and meaning, getting the brief and whatever. I was never driven to be a designer. I didn't have those heroes. I think it's the wrong question for me.
Well, what about Frank Lloyd Wright? I mean, did you...
Well, but again,
you knew about him.
I did know about him, and Falling Water again was the second most photographed building in the world, and influenced endless designs in undergraduate life. But I think his other one, was it the Johnson Wax building with those amazing columns that went up, and just amazing stuff. No, I was aware of them all, Bob, but I don't think I'd have sort of killed for it. I don't think it would never have occurred to me to go to America to see a Wright building.
Well, but you talked about Ronchon, and there was a version of Ronchon built in Brisbane. Were you aware of that?
No, where was that from?
The Wickham Terrace. Barry Walduck did a Lutheran church, which he said was inspired by Ronchon, and he designed it as a concrete building. And when it came to build it, they said, well, the only way they could build it was to have permanent shuttering formwork in brick. So they built brick walls and poured the concrete down the cavity, and that's the way it is. And the walls are so thick because of that technique.
Ronchop itself is just rubble construction. I think it's concrete. I remember Ralph Bailey saying to me once, in that earnest Ralph Bailey way, of course it's not a concrete building, Dick. It's it's actually just been iced over. You know. No, I'm sure there are other buildings that I appreciate, but I don't remember being driven, and I don't even remember. I couldn't list now Birrell's, I say he's a hero. I don't know where John Railton's houses were. I mean, they were just. It was at the time I was impressed, enthused. Yeah. And there were plenty of stodgy practices around to compare them with too. Of course, I mean there was some pretty awful stuff being built by the bigger firms.
Yeah. Well, the impact. This last section, impact and Queensland architecture today. Who were the significant architects who worked in your office? Do you feel your practices had any impact on present day architecture in Queensland?
We had, like most practices, we had a usual stream of people passing through, and they all made a contribution. Most people stayed for a long time. And they've and some of them have gone on to some other things. I mean, Fiona Gardner worked for us, Jinx Miles, Steve Murray, Peter Kyle himself. I mean, there's a whole range of people, Who came
Meredith?
through? Meredith. Well, Meredith never worked for me. Meredith and I shared the office at Spring Hill. She wasn't never an employee. I make that clear because Meredith sees this. She'll be horrified if I get something wrong again.
So do you feel your practice has had any impact on present day architecture?
One can only hope that all that work from the years with the National Trust and all that people have picked up the idea that heritage has some value. Yes, I think so. I think all my years of teaching at QUT had an influence too.
Well, you were an adjunct there too.
I was for a while, a couple of years. But it was the teaching design was fun because I taught on my sort of terms of not taking anything at face value. But the history was the bit I think where I may have influenced some people because some years ago I had a postcard from a former student who was in Venice or Vienna or whatever, and I said, "You Richard, I've just realised what you were talking about," which I thought was pretty rough. But even now, I mean, young practices ring and want me to come and do a bit of work for them. The first question I have to ask, I say, "Did I teach you?" And they say, "Yes." I say, "Did I pass you?" Which is always like a yes answer to that. No, we don't want.
But you did design some buildings, some modern buildings. I can remember a house out at Longreach you did for Boo.
Oh, yes.
Is that a name?
Yes, Henrik's, yes, that was a lovely house.
Now, I saw it once from being driven past it at speed, but I've no idea what it's really like. I had a lot of bougainvillea growing over it.
They were lovely clients. Boo Henrik was one of my first clients in that she was involved with the Flying Arts School, and they used as the headquarters the old QATB building in Longreach. And you were involved in that one too, Bob. You did the fire stair.
That's right.
Remember, I said I wanted the fire stair to be a sculptural piece. What was his name? The British sculptor in steel. Anyway, I went downtown at lunchtime. I came back with his book. I said, "That's what it has to look like." And we built this stair. We had to have it. There were universal beams rolled into a curve. It had to be rolled in Rockhampton and shipped out. Terrible expense, architectural folly. No, the Henriks themselves lived on a property out of town called Talleyrand. And as they got older, their son wanted to take it over, and they wanted to move to town. Dick Henrik, her husband, wasn't at all keen to move, and Boo came to us and said, "Design us a house and make it as much like Talleyrand as you can, because otherwise Dick will never move off the property." So we designed this enormous house on a big block of land. But again, it was a lovely house. It had a winter end and a summer end. Because Longreach, you have to do that. So at the winter end, there was a hard floor and glass windows, so that it would heat up with the solar load. The summer end, it opened into a giant bush house that was again sprayed from the ceiling, so that in the summertime there was natural cooling, natural heating, and winter natural cooling. And an enormous garage, so that Dick Henrik could bring all his hobbies into town with him. Like many of those buildings in the bush, it was built by Bob Pope, the flying builder, who used to load all these bits and pieces into his aeroplane and fly them around the country. No, it was a nice big house. We did another nice one up at where's the Turtle Rookery out of Bundaberg. Anyway, Bagara. From a Melbourne judge who wanted to retire up there, and that was a lovely house, built in zones for grandchildren and visitors to come. And we've done some lovely houses, and for lovely clients too. I mean, there's nothing quite like a domestic client for either making or breaking a friendship. And Desley Campbell Stewart, we haven't spoken about. Now, my wife, originally an employee, then a director, was very good at designing houses, but wonderful at dealing with clients. She could take a brief and nod wisely and then do what was necessary. Whereas I would, if I got the wrong end of a brief, I would say something like, "Oh, don't be ridiculous," or "We're not doing that." It doesn't go down well with clients often. No, so there were a lot of houses, well, a handful of houses built, and some alterations done. But
and adaptive reuse, I guess we talked about the roundhouse as being probably the one you remember, but there are others. I can't think what they are. But.
Well, I think the again, you know, this is a ridiculous interview, Bob, because you're in every other answer I'm giving here. The Potter's Gallery, the Penny Methodist Church in New Brunswick Street was bought by the Queensland Potters Association, and they wanted to turn it into an art gallery, and you and I designed a lovely loft within the building that didn't touch the walls, that was freestanding in the building, and then a hall, an original church hall at the back, and you designed a very nice link that joined that and the church building, and that, I think that was an early and positive success.
Yeah, that got us into a bit of trouble as well to build it, because we drew the old building with the roof pitch that you assumed was the same on either side, and it wasn't. And because it had moved a bit, and so you drew it at this pitch, and they built the new steel structure at what you'd drawn, and they didn't measure.
Didn't fit, no.
They didn't check it.
No,
and
no.
We didn't twig that it was a bit off until they put one against the other, and then.
I only vaguely remember that. I do remember a retaining wall in that same building. It was a Besser block wall. It couldn't have been more than 600 high. And for some reason, we had power points in this wall. Well, the inevitable happened, of course. The drainage failed, or if there was any drainage there at all, and the retaining wall filled up with water. And the Potters rang and said, "You better come down," because our office was just 2 houses away, and have a look at this, because there seems to be a bit of a problem. When I got there, I said, "What's the problem?" They said, "Well, these power points are behaving quite strangely. This power point, these 3 little jets of water were coming out of the power point." I said, "I can't remember where we put the switchboard, but show me quickly." We're all blown to kingdom come. No, but this, these are stories of rainwater, and no, this is what happens. The nice thing, I think the nice thing is that I've had such a good time in architecture from those early days of thinking I'd like to be an architect and going down on Saturday morning and having Duncan McPhee's mother teach me how to draw. And drawing is it. The other wonderful thing about Queensland University that I didn't mention was that we did life drawing. And I look at architects today, and when I work with, traditionally I've worked with lots of practices, doing the conservation part to their design part, and I say, "Just do a little sketch showing me how that's going to look," and they go away and they come back with a CAD drawing, and I say, no, I want a little sketch. And there's a whole generation, notwithstanding the fact that we're getting better architecture now than in our day, there's a whole generation of people, graduate, competent architects, who cannot draw. They can't draw. And look, I've got boxes of 2B pencils here. I can't think without a 2B pencil. And one of my retirement plans was to go back to life drawing, because it's so liberating. But whole generations just can't draw. They have no interest in drawing, which fascinates me, because I can't. I just think to draw is to...
Well, the life classes wouldn't have been at the university, would they?
Oh, yes.
They were...
No, the life classes...
the CAS, Contemporary Arts Society.
Yes, we did go there, but no, there were life classes as part of the curriculum at UQ in the early days.
Oh, not a clue.
And I can't think who took them. I can't imagine. Oh yes, no.
Bill Carr, probably.
No, it wasn't Bill Carr. No. Anyway, so that was very good. But right from then, right up till now, I'm still having a good time. I love it. I love it. And you see things architecturally. The world. Once an architect, always an architect. That's the terrible truth of it. You see the world architecturally.
Well, thinking of that, what new buildings after 1975 do you think that are okay here? Is there anything you like?
I think one of the most successful buildings in Brisbane in the last decade is Donovan Hill's Library. I reckon it just works beautifully. The undercroft, the entrance, the relationship to the river. I can go to the library and just for a sit in a comfortable chair. Why would you go to your club somewhere or other and stare into a brick wall when you can go over to South Brisbane, get into the library for nothing, walk through, and any of those rooms, they've all got deep leather armchairs that no one else seems to have heard about, and you can sit there and have a little doze, a little think. I love it. Well, it's the nicest building, but it works as an entry too. I love the undercroft. I love imagine it's free Wi-Fi and that little concrete bench that backs onto the coffee shop. I love just walking through there and seeing young people sitting there, all just chatting, and it's a very nice building, and I think it works. I think it works as an extension to Robert Gibson's library, and I think there's enough early library there that you can get an idea that something's changed. He hasn't sort of smudged over the whole issue. I think it works. I think it works as a new building in that it's generous, its circulation and its use is visible, but it works as an urban form. I think it relates beautifully to the whole.
Well, that big space is all naturally ventilated too.
Yes.
And naturally lit.
Yes.
There's nothing else quite like that.
And compared to the art gallery next door, which is the new Goma, which again is a very good building in its way, with a much more complex brief, given the need for the care of works of art. I think the library was actually quite a low budget. I mean, I love it. It's one of those places that I can go if I'm in town. I think I'll just go and sit in the library for a while. Now that's very nice, isn't it? It's a very anyway. I think that sort of takes the. I give that number one.
That's the last question.
Good.
You've done well. How long have you done?
Did that take too long?
2 hours.
2 hours. I'm sorry.